Visual novels are a genre of games with a really long history behind them. In fact, one could probably even trace the origins of this genre all the way back to the text-based RPGs of old, such as Zog, as well as Hideo Death Stranding Kojima's Snatcher as well. It's part of the reason why the genre of games that are visual novels in Japan are sometimes still called ADV games, as in adventure games, and why the segment in a visual novel where you have the characters talking to each other with the text below is sometimes called an ADV part within these games within Japan as well. While some people may dispute still the first ever visual novel to come out afterwards, really far back that we have to trace this, people can generally kind of agree that it might have been Otogiriso by Spike Chunsoft, which was released in 1992. I know that companies such as Alicesoft as well as Elf actually released their first ever games all the way back in 1989, but those tend to mirror more RPG games instead, whereas with Spike Chunsoft's game at the time, it really felt like one of the first ever games where the main focus is on just reading a story presented to you with background art, music to support it, and you just basically made text choices such as in a old adventure, choose your own adventure book, and you progress the story and got a different ending based off of that alone. Though that said, at the time the game was more of a horror focused one, and it did seem like many of the earlier titles outside consumer platforms seems to be horror ones, and not so much the dating sims or the more character focused games of today. Although I guess with something like Asaya no Ota, for example, you still kind of get a little bit of both at once. That said, we're not here to talk in depth about the origin and history of the genre. If there's any interest in that, we can probably do that in another video in the future, but that feels like something that would take a lot longer and it might be a little bit out of my field of expertise as well. What we're here to talk about today is more of some of my observations of how the genre or the industry that produces these games, especially the bigger companies within it, seem to be shifting over the last few years especially. For some of you, you might already know that I used to work in Infinibrain in the past for a while. This is one of the companies that made some of the big SUS games, and while I can't speak about the company I'm working in now, since like Japan is a little, like the companies tend to be a little strict on how their employees can interact with social media, so it would put my own employability at risk, so we're not going to talk about that one. But suffice to say that I've spoken to quite a few of the bigger sized companies within the space, and one thing that I seem to generally notice is that a lot of them seem to really want to move away from producing the big package titles that they have been producing all this time, such as these games over here, for example, where they come in big boxes with the game, maybe some items as well as like the manual and all. And that was something that really struck me, especially with Infinibrain at the time, since part of the reason why I was employed into the company was because they also wanted to eventually shift out of visual novels, and their focus was on trying to get developers in to help them produce games outside of this space. And since then, the company has been constantly dabbling out of the space. Like their first successful few titles were things like Taimanin RPG, which is a browser game on certain sites that I don't think are accessible outside of Japan. You had them producing Action Taimanin, which is a mobile game with a fair amount of success, since it actually reached the point where it was just right on the line to be able to release globally, even though the content is kind of sussy, like with Azure Lane, for example. And the thing with all of these titles is that they seem to be mobile games. And not only that, but at the same time, it does seem like they're actually reducing and cutting back the number of visual novels that they're producing. In fact, especially when it comes to the Taimanin series, there are many fans who lament the fact that they stopped producing visual novels for this specific series almost altogether at this point. And the thing is, it's not just them. Like the biggest example of a success would probably be something like Type Moon, which is at this point more of an IP management firm than a game firm. You have companies like Visual Arts and Baysun, which are constantly trying to produce and release new games outside of the space. Both of them kind of have at least a successful mobile title, although the way that they got the title successful is kind of different, while still trying to juggle that with actually producing visual novels. And you have companies like Nitro Plus, which are trying to dabble into producing consumer titles, that's to say full price titles on Steam as well. The fact of the matter is that many companies seem to be working to try and get out of just being a visual novel company alone. And one thing I noticed with all of this is that, especially across like the past 10-15 years, many of these big companies seem to be trying to do this by going into mobile games or gacha games in particular instead. While it is easy to say that yes, they kind of are doing this because it's easy money, I'd say that there is a little more to it than just that. After all, if the goal was to just make a ton of money, there are other ways to do it as well, especially in this day and age where making a profitable live service title is more difficult than it probably has ever been in the past like 10 years, if anything. This is something that as a result I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I guess in a way this video is just my perspective on why this potentially seems to be happening. So before we go further into the video, I want you guys to take a look at something. I have here with me some fairly old visual novels, fairly recent depending on how many years you've been cryogenically frozen. Like for example, I have here with me the first ever, I guess not the first ever, but Leaf's third ever visual novel, Too Hard. The original one, not the one that just came out recently. Right, you can even see here, it even says it. And more importantly, I want you guys to look at something over here, which is this big red text at the bottom. As you can see, this game cost 8,800 yen back in the day. And it's not just this title that does something like this, right? It's not like just the game because of the fact that it's really old and it came out during an era where games like this would have been more expensive, used to cost this much. Even with something like this Koihime Muso game over here, which came out maybe like 15 years after that, if you will look at the price, it has actually gone up. And it's not like this is something new or something that's only used to happen in the past. If you were to look at something like the most recent Da Capo game, it still costs quite a fair amount of money. Like the price of visual novels in general, especially the ones produced by the bigger brand companies out there, haven't exactly gone down much. And I feel like this is something that tends to get a lot neglected, especially when looked at by people overseas outside of Japan, because of the fact that if you buy the games off of Steam or Manga Gamer, they tend to be a lot cheaper. And because of the fact that many of these games never even really got an English translation for the longest of times, I know that many people may not have used the most legal of means to acquire this game. So the idea of paying more than a AAA game's price for a visual novel may seem insane to some people, but yeah, that's the world that we used to live in. And it's like this because visual novels, what it might seem very simple to produce, they aren't really that cheap to produce, to be honest, especially when you're going for something as big as some of the 40-hour length visual novels that some of these companies have made. After all, we're talking about fully voicing a game which has 40 to potentially 60 hours of in-game dialogue that's almost continually happening if we were to just have it auto from start to end, which is not a very cheap process to be able to actually record all of that. For most of these companies, particularly the smaller ones, they don't actually have their own studios. Most of them actually have to rent the studio to do the recording. And unless you have someone you know who's willing to work as the voice actresses for all of this, hiring a voice actor tends to be very expensive, especially for the more famous ones out there. Even for an amateur voice actress at this point, I feel like the cheapest I've seen in recent years would be maybe somewhere around like 50 yen per word. Yeah, you know, we don't pay them by the hour or by the hiring period. Typically, you're paying them by the word that they have to say. It's part of the reason why, especially for many of these smaller companies, especially when this industry was first growing, they would just get someone else that they knew around them to help with the recording, because it is a lot more financially sustainable and make more sense than hiring someone that could potentially cost you a lot of money. Like the most expensive one I know, although it's more for like general anime stuff, the rates can go up to something like even 1,000 yen a word. And it's not only that, you don't just pay them for the word, you don't just pay for the studio, you have to sometimes, depending on the contract, especially if you're hiring someone from a voice acting agency, pay some level of the transport to get them to and from the location as well. So prices can balloon a lot just from ensuring that a game with 5 to 6 characters can be fully voiced. And it's not just that the amount of voice acting that goes in is extremely heavy. While some people may not even notice it, the soundtracks for some of these games, especially the bigger titles, can actually be fairly insane. Like the original soundtrack for Little Bastards, which released in 2007, that has 53 tracks in it. Like you're talking about companies that are producing soundtracks to the equivalent of what some of the RPG games out there are producing. That obviously takes a lot of time, and it also takes a lot of man hours to actually get all of this produced to the extent that they are. So really, it's not like they're just cheaping out on some of the content of the game intentionally to make it a very affordable genre in the first place. And aside from that, you of course need a good artist, a good writer. And the thing is, with all of this, right, the artist, the musician, the writer, the voice actresses, they all kind of need to be paid to, you know, actually produce a game, right? You can't produce a game without a job. And for people whose full-time job is to produce these games, this means that you need to be able to, at minimum, sustain these people along with the programmer who's needed to put the game together, as well as potentially a director who needs to make sure everything is consistent. Sometimes the director is one of these people. Basically, they just run multiple roles. But at the very least, if you have a bunch of people who only are specialized at one thing, you would still need maybe like 5 to 6 people, not including the voice actors and actresses. kids who expect to be paid like X amount every month in order to be able to, just keep themselves alive, and to also ensure that they can actually continue to do this as a job and produce this kind of content full time. And this can balloon, especially if a game takes a long time to produce. If you were to pay each of this person, like let's say for example back in the day, many of them didn't even graduate from university. Let's just say you earned like $1,800 a month, right? To just keep 5 amateurs who just graduated from high school in, you would still be paying them the equivalent of 90,000 yen per month to keep the thing running. So in an entire year, that's about 1,000,000 yen to just all of these fresh graduates. But if they were all fresh graduates, you would probably not be taking just a year, and you probably wouldn't be able to produce something of high quality enough, which means that even trying to cover that 1,000,000 yen could be very difficult. I mean, we're not even including the price to hire the voice actresses within this 1,000,000 yen. But that said, especially back in the 90s, you could still say that visual novels were quite technologically comparable in certain fields to the many other titles that were out there at the time, because while you would look at many of the AAA titles that are being produced, things like Final Fantasy and Pokemon, while when it comes to the gameplay itself, those games were a lot more complicated and in-depth in terms of how you go about interacting with the game, because of the fact that these games had to deal with all of that, and because back in the day, when it came to the amount of space that you had on your hardware, there was a limit to how much you could put into a game because CDs and cartridges were very limited in space. Many of these games had to forego things on the graphical side, so many of them focus on just having like pixelated characters, for example, just small little 2D pixel avatars instead. Or even with Pokemon, while you did have the Pokemon fully fleshed out, most of them you could still see that the design was a little rough around the edges. But with visual novels, because of the fact that they were focused a lot more on the stories and the characters, many of them actually put a lot more emphasis on the design, and as a result, when it came to how the characters look within the game, many of these games actually focus on things that other titles and other genres did not, and this gave them a unique niche because of the combination of the art that was in the game, the music. And when you went into the mid-90s, you kind of started to see titles such as Tokimeki Memorial, for example, as well as some of the other titles that slowly started to incorporate voice to some extent. Granted, many visual novels at the time still did not, but you started to see a slow trend of them adopting it at a rate that was even faster than arguably some of the competitors in other genres, with games such as Kimi ga Nozumu AN being fully voiced in 2001, and even with something like Giniro. The game, while it was only fully voiced much later after its release in a premium version of the game, the original versions were still partially voiced at the time, which would have been around the same time that FF10 would have released, and was the first voiced Final Fantasy title at the time. And this obviously allowed many of these groups to therefore expand and get bigger and form into full corporate entities of their own as well, right? Companies such as Type Moon, companies such as Visual Arts, they all got a lot bigger during this period, slowly starting to reach like the 30s in their numbers as well in terms of the employees. And because of the fact that they were able to command such a high price for the number of people working on the game, this also meant that especially in those earlier years, they were actually able to get quite some level of profitability, which allowed them to expand a lot quicker to reach the size that they are at now, especially for some of the bigger companies at least. You start to produce as well as try to work with other companies to produce games outside of the genre. You kind of now need additional people to assist with the songwriting, the script writing, the programmers as well, so that you can continue to release titles at a much quicker pace. And you're also going to start to see them start to hire all of the business people as well to help with things like marketing, merchandising, events, as they try to expand, especially for those that were trying to reach out to a more global audience as well. However, while they did manage to find market success and enough sales to be able to grow to the size that they are now, the thing is that with these types of games, especially since many of them have adult content in them, they are kind of restricted in the number of people that they can reach out to, and they aren't really super high in sales unless you had a really massive hit on your hands. Like, I have here with me some of the data collected by a magazine called Push, which basically tried to document the sales as well as like get the sales rankings monthly for many of these visual novels out there. And they actually have been in operation for quite a long time, although the magazine has ended now. And they would reach out to some of the big stores that to try and figure out how much sales was going through these sources, especially since in Japan for a long time, we didn't really have ways to purchase these games online. And when you look at the numbers, many of these games don't really even exceed 20,000 in sales on the first month of release. Most of the titles that came in first, they don't really reappear the next month after, implying that they do like 20,000 in the first month and become first, and then in the next month they are below 10th, be doing like 800 to 700 in sales. So overall, it's not like most of them are doing crazy numbers all around, which kind of makes sense because the number of people who can purchase the game are limited. And I can imagine this will come as a surprise to many people overseas, especially because while it might seem that like the whole idea of visual novels is a very integral part of the whole anime culture overall, the thing is that, especially back in the day, prior to the release of Tokimeki Memorial, many of these titles were basically seen as like not very high quality games to begin with, and it was actually quite a big shock that Konami was even producing such a title. But it was around that era forward where the genre actually began to see a big leap in its quality, but even then, it was something that still wasn't the most popular thing, to the point that when the first big controversy that led to much of the censorship that the government put in place for visual novels occurred, it barely made 3 paragraphs in the article that reported it, and we'll talk more about this in a future video when we actually go a bit more into the incident itself. But for now, suffice to say, it used to be something that wasn't too big, and this was doubly so for their sales outside of Japan, where it does feel like until some of the big animes that came out for things such as the Studio Dean adaptation of Fate Stay Night, and things such as Lucky Star, for example, as well as the whole moe anime culture that slowly started to build up over time, which started to put otaku media in general in a better light, I would feel like. But suffice to say, sales were generally not high, not within Japan, and even more so outside of Japan, where there were barely any form of translations at all. And on top of that, some people might get turned off from playing the game because of the fact that, especially for those with a bit more of adult content within them, the censorship that exists in the depiction that is put in place because the government is scared of actual adults seeing a dick or something, it can get very disruptive. For those of you who have played some of Bason's games, like for the Japanese audio, sometimes they would even put an obnoxious bleep when they're talking about certain words as well, like even to talk about a man's they would sometimes bleep out the word completely, so it can be very distracting, and you can imagine it would take people out who may have actually wanted to purchase and play this game because of the censorship alone. And this has been further exacerbated by the fact that with recent years, the idea of game development has been a lot more democratized than it has ever been before, where it has gotten a lot easier for you to be able to just produce your own thing and just sell it online on a platform like Steam, for example. And not only that, but even with things like the engine, for example, it's a lot easier for you to just pick up an engine and slowly learn to be able to develop these games on your own. Something that for many of these companies back then, the engines were a lot more restricted and knowledge of how to use them weren't as widespread, and therefore there was a lot more difficulty in even getting something of this sort to be produced in the first place, with some companies such as Visual Arts, for example, even using their own custom in-house engine instead. However, point is that because of this, there are many more people producing similar types of games, and they're also pricing a lot lower because of the fact that they have the ability to, right? You have things like Gundog on Steam, for example. It's a full all ages game, and the price is a lot more competitive compared to something that's charging you about 9,000 yen. And even if you want an adult game, you could just go to Steam and they still do have, or although maybe less than before, a huge repository of games that you could pick from, visual novels that focus on more specific things that you enjoy, all at a much more affordable price as well. And even for the big companies, they do tend to sell their games overseas at a lower price than they do in Japan, which at the very least for consumer, like full box games, it's always been a lot of bizarre to me, but we'll leave that aside for now. Fact of the matter is that as a result of this, competition has increased, and it became a lot harder for many of these companies that actually grew in an era where they could afford to produce games to sell at a much higher price and learned how to work and operate around that price, now find themselves in a situation where it has become a lot harder to actually get people to adopt the game for the ask price, which then makes it a lot harder for them to continue to sustain their methods of production. However, it's then also difficult to then ask a company to suddenly drop their price by more than half in order to stay competitive. After all, they still have people to pay, rent to pay, a brand to maintain, production, plus the type of development experience that they have, doesn't really allow them to rapidly pivot into another genre of games, nor does it allow them to suddenly be able to optimize, to be able to cut costs to the point where they can then make the titles competitive again. Especially in Japan, where it gets very difficult to fire people, it's a lot harder to just suddenly decide to just cut half your staff and try to operate with just these smaller groups alone. And even if they did do that, there's also no guarantee that the amount of consumers they would get an increase from slashing the prices in half would actually be able to offset the amount of profits lost per capita at this point. For a company that has grown as big as it has, many of them, it gets a lot more difficult to then be willing to take the hit and try to do something like this, especially in a situation where you're not already doing all that well. And I feel like this is very well reflected in some of the talk that came up in the industry, especially from visual arts at the time, from people like Maeda Jun, like the ex-CEO Baba, where they were talking about how it did feel like it was getting a lot harder to continue producing visual novels and sustaining the company off of that. Even in their case, where they were already out there targeting a much larger audience with family-friendly titles and also able to license out their IPs to make animes of them that were actually fairly successful at the time. And as you can imagine, this has only gotten worse in recent years because of all the censorship that's been happening for them trying to get their games onto platforms such as Steam, because of all the things that have been happening with the credit card companies, for example. Which is not to say that this was the origin of what made it difficult for them, because Steam has for a long time been fairly strict on specifically visual novels as well. I mean, the platform does have a lot of adult games, but visual novels tend to be very heavily scrutinized as well, with sometimes some of the companies I've spoken to actually talking about how like they would send a game out for application and Steam would only get back to them 6 months later or something. So it can actually cause the company's ability to cycle through its titles to maintain a long-term profitability to be a lot more difficult when it could potentially take that long. And even with an all ages title like Holy Undead, for example, that apparently was actually rejected from being put on Steam because they didn't actually let the people over at Steam know that some of the characters were underage, even though the characters actually don't do anything adult in that sense. And on top of that, as technology has improved over the years, it has gotten a lot harder for many of these visual novels to compete on just the premise of their games being of high quality, because while the music can be great, while the graphics, the way that you would depict the characters and it can look great, the story can be wonderful. All of this can combine together to produce a wonderful product. However, because of what the genre is, where it needs to be a visual novel first, there is a limit to how much they can actually make use of new technology to further improve what already exists. You could use something like Spine, for example, to actually give the 2D character art some level of movement, make them look like they're breathing more alive, have them actually move more vividly within these scenes. You can have the backgrounds look even better. But the thing is that in the end, there are really limits to how much more all of these things can already be improved. Meanwhile, for something like FPS, for example, you can use all of the technology that exists out there now to go in all sorts of different ways. You could make the game more realistic, like some of the hyper-realistic FPSs that people seem to like nowadays. You could use it to make something that performs really well and that just feels very exciting to play, all while having a more modern processing power, so it actually works a lot better. And with RPG games as well, when you look at something like FF16 compared to what FF7 initially was back in the 90s, you can see that not only has the genre changed a lot, but the ways that you can get people to interact with the medium has changed so much that you could actually shift out of a turn-based game and make it fully action and still have it flow seamlessly as well. I know some people maybe don't like the fact that it's not turn-based anymore. Personally, I prefer my turn-based RPGs as well, but the fact of the matter is that all of these things that maybe 20 years ago would have been really difficult to do are now a lot easier for companies to be able to do. And as a result, because of this, the value proposition that visual novels had kind of hit what I think some people in the industry call some level of an evolutionary dead end, where unless you start to shift out of the genre of being just a visual novel, there isn't really any way that you can improve the contents of the game in a way that can take advantage of all of the new technology that has come out recently. Which is not to say that therefore visual novels are a dead genre because of the fact that the evolution of it has reached a dead end. Rather, what I'm trying to say is that the concept of a visual novel and representing it in such a way may have already reached its peak, and any further ways or attempts to try and improve or change it up is probably gonna lead to it slowly shifting in its genre to being something else. For example, if you were to try to make a visual novel more animated, you can only do that so far before you basically have a animated manga, basically, or what would be almost close enough to be considerable an anime instead. Meanwhile, if you were to try to put more and more gameplay into it, it's eventually just gonna turn into an action game, a RPG, or something else, precisely because of the addition of the gameplay. I mean, sure, you could do things with the graphics, like change it from being 2D, the more older school moe bishoujo anime type art style, to something that's more 3D instead. But in the end, doing that in and of itself isn't exactly improving the genre, right? You're just going from 2D to 3D. It's just a change in style. But in the end, it's not really doing something that is revolutionizing what a visual novel is, because the concept of what it's meant to be is extremely simple but extremely effective as well. Which is why even when people try to shake up the genre, a lot of what they talk about is more of changing how things are presented within the novel or the style of storytelling, both of which are good ways to make a story novel and interesting. But at the same time, it's not something that is going to shake up the genre itself, and it may not necessarily even need any shaking up to begin with, to be able to tell a story in the way that the genre wants to, in a way that is effective. What I am trying to say is that if a company somehow finds itself in a situation where just producing visual novels on its own is no longer able to cover its constantly expanding size, then trying to constantly ramp up or find ways to improve the genre the same way the RPGs have, going from something like FF1 all the way to what FF16 is nowadays, is not something that can be quite as easily done. There isn't a way for them to really try and improve the type of content that they're producing in terms of visual novels to reach out to a far greater audience, other than changing things such as the themes of the story itself, which, depending on how reliant on the writer a company might be, it might be very difficult for them to just branch out, or they may not even want to take the virality route of just specifically targeting specific genres, and would rather push the stories that they want to. But in doing so, they would therefore need to find other ways to do it outside of the genre, because of the fact that the company has overexpanded, and it's really hard for them to upkeep themselves simply producing visual novels and pursuing the creative stories that they want to tell within just this medium alone. For the people who really enjoy the genre for what it is, this is not something that they potentially will want, all of this graphical improvements, all of this shift to like action-based role-playing games. They just want something that basically allows them to enjoy the visual novel at their own pace in the way that they want to, and in a way that allows them to focus more on appreciating what the story or the characters are about in a more relaxed environment. And so it's very difficult for them to then also want to shift out of just being a visual novel company, because you risk alienating some of the people that even got the company to this point in the first place without even knowing whether or not there's going to be something on the other side. That said, this is not to say that visual novels are, in my opinion, a dead or dying genre, because the genre still produces content that is very unique and that gives people an experience that most other types of games do not. While some people might mock the fact that like visual novels don't have like super intensive gameplay, and like people will meme the fact that like, oh, you just sit there and push A all the time. It's like, you can tell these people are tourists in the first place because of the fact that they don't know that most visual novels have an auto feature to begin with. But that aside, it does provide a very relaxed experience and allows you to enjoy the story, the music, and everything in its entirety in a way that many other genres, because of the fact that they're so action-packed, or there's so many things for you to do, there's stress and pressure on you to do something in particular, that you may just miss out on some of the little things within the plot or the game that would have otherwise been able to be easily picked up with a visual novel. You're really able to spend more time focusing on conveying the world, the characters, and the story to the players in an environment where their brain is more relaxed and receptive to a lot of this content. And it is part of the reason why, even till this day, you do still see companies that use it as a medium of storytelling, although in ways that might be a little more different, with like things like Gamedev, with things like Needy Streamer Overdose. All of these are games that still use the genre because of the fact that in a way it allows you to tell stories in a way that people would be more easily able to enjoy, while also using it as a way to ensure that they can make games in a way that is more cost effective and able to focus on the story than making something like an action RPG, for example. And I'm not saying that it's fully loss making either. It can still be profitable, which is why there are still companies within the space focusing on making just visual novels as well, right? You have companies such as Yuzusoft, Frontwing, for example, which are still largely focused on the concept of making visual novels, maybe hopefully getting these animated lot, but they still stay within the space of what made visual novel companies what they are, focusing on the type of games that the people who enjoy this style of games enjoy. However, one thing you would notice with the companies that tend to be successful, or the groups that tend to be successful, is that they tend to be the ones that didn't really overexpand. They tend to be the ones that are still of a fairly small size, with most of them typically not even exceeding like 30 people within the company, as compared to something like Infinite Brain, for example, which was at around 60 around the time I was still there. And you could say the same for Virtual Arts and Bason as well. When a company gets above a certain size, it becomes unsustainable. But yeah, to summarize, since I feel like this point actually became really long, many of the bigger companies in particular have actually just grown to sizes where it becomes no longer sustainable to try to keep the company afloat through just the use of visual novels, especially with the shifts in the industry that have made it more difficult to command the prices that they have, while costs aren't exactly going down either. There, and both within and outside of Japan, there has been for a long time restrictions on the types of ways that they can sell the games and type of games that they can produce. And as a result, there tends to be restrictions on the industry that makes it less profitable overall. And these restrictions over the years have only gotten worse, even within Japan as well. Like really, when I see the people who come together for the actual like visual novel exclusive like corporate events, there's actually a lot of doom and gloom within the events, because it just feels to many people like it's gotten tougher and tougher to continue producing the type of content that they are. And because of the fact that within Japan it's a lot harder both from a legal and cultural standpoint to actually fire people, it makes it a lot harder for these companies to actually try to just cut the number of employees to try and make themselves profitable. So the best way that many of them could think of to actually try to become more profitable was to shift into trying to make other types of games that would expand their repertoire and potentially allow them to reach out to a wider audience with titles that might potentially sell better, all while also gaining the experience needed to also produce other genres of games in the first place. And as you can imagine, they would want to look for a style of game that is fairly on the less expensive side to produce, so that there's less risk of them experimenting the new genre, all while also still having the potential upside to match the days when they could sell a single game for 9,800 yen or higher. And this brings us to the next point. Now granted, if you look at the top end of the mobile gaming space, yeah, it doesn't look all that easy to make anymore. When you look at games like Genshin or any of the other MiHoYo games like Wu1, Nikkei and all of this, the games aren't exactly simplistic, they aren't easy to code, they aren't easy to design, and they aren't exactly cheap either, especially when you consider the type of voice actresses and actors they are using. And some of you might be actually wondering and like raising your eyebrows, wondering like what kind of cardboard crack this guy is actually smoking. This kind of cardboard crack. But jokes aside though, what is true that many of these games, they have at the top end gotten a lot closer to AAA games in terms of the quality of the content, and like there's a whole another can of worms that we could probably go into in a future video. But the thing is that the scene in the industry for mobile games has not always been at that level, and even till this day, many of the games, especially when you go out of the top 50 games, aren't exactly that superly high intensive in terms of the graphical as well as the design overall as well. When looking at the history of why visual novel companies chose mobile gaming as a way to get out of the visual novel industry, one needs to look at where this industry actually started from, which basically means going back all the way to the era where feature phones were a thing. I've already talked about this in like 2 videos, the more or less like the early origins of the mobile gaming scene in Japan. If you want to know what I've talked about so far, you can go and look for the respective segments in each of these videos. I'll put the link in the description down below instead. However, to just summarize it very immensely this time around, the games used to be designed for phones with a lot lower specs than even the earliest iPhones. They needed to work with a slow internet connection, and therefore games tended to be very simplistic. The amount that you could earn on the high end was really high for a very low cost input at the time. All of this because the games were basically aimed for playing on simple mobile platforms that allowed you to play casually on the go, because people used to just play this type of games on transport, like on the train for example, and maybe while they were chilling from the TV or something. So not something that was meant to be a very hardcore game in the first place. For companies that never made a foray out of visual novel development, this made a good starting point if they wanted to go into it themselves and stumble and fumble around a little before actually reaching the point where they can actually develop a good game of their own, because they didn't really have to make a super solid game design wise, because the requirements of the platform meant that you could make something more simplistic and people would still play and enjoy it. And even if there were issues because of the live service nature of the game, you could still try to fix this over time and try to improve things so that eventually the game would reach a state that is more well appreciated by the players. Things like adding QOL improvements, rebalancing, or adding in solutions to some of the balance issues within the game. All of that could slowly be learned and fixed on the go instead. And so for companies that were actually trying to find a way into a new industry, doing all of this in an environment where the stakes were a lot lower meant that they could essentially try to make like 5 to 10 mobile games and like just fail over and over. And even if those games didn't earn much, the amount of money that they would have lost wouldn't have been something that would have actually jeopardized the company financially at the time. Plus, the success of some of the future titles within the mobile game industry, such as FGO, Princess Connect, some of the Square Enix games like Sinnoh Alice and Valkyrie Anatomia, you basically started to see that there was a trend towards people actually wanting stories in their games. Because compared to the earlier titles in the space, with things such as Kan Kole, Puzzles and Dragons, Monster Strike, even with something like the earlier days of Grand Blue, for example, the idea of like having a very deep and interesting, captivating story wasn't as much of a thing. But over time, these character stories, this overall arcing plots, became so much bigger of a thing within what made some of the later titles differentiated from the rest. And even today, with games like Genshin, with games like Nikkei, Blue Archive, Counter-Strike, what have you not, most of them are a lot more character and story focused. And this meant that for many of these visual novel companies, this became a even more opportune industry for them to enter, as their strengths, which lay in more of the writing as well as all of the peripherals around making a good novel, allowed them to enter the space and have a strong differentiating factor of their own right off the bat. That said, most of them did try to continue to maintain the adult side of their works as well, which is why many people overseas may not see many of the titles, because many of them are just relegated to being on something like DMM, for example, and whether or not they get an English release is very up in the air. But essentially, the stage was set for many of them to try to break out of the visual novel space and actually reach out in another industry, and many of them did actually take this risk and this opportunity to attempt to do so, be it by trying to completely develop something in-house or leasing out the IP or the company's writers to someone else, like with something like Heaven Burns Red, for example, where the game was developed by a different company but the writer was from Visual Arts, as well as something like FGO, for example, where while Nasu was involved in the title, most of the art and design was outsourced to a different company, which we have talked about in the past, and the gameplay itself was also outsourced to the Lightwork. So in a sense, the game will be a product of multiple companies working together instead. But even if they would outsource it to another company, it's not like they are getting zero knowledge out of it. They still get to learn, and in some cases you could say that they get a better opportunity to learn, because by outsourcing it to another company, they get to then work with the company and see how the design process is like within this companies. And with luck and some talent, you can basically try to understand how all of these thought processes work, all of the design fundamentals, and then try to use that to in the future make your own title should you decide to go in that direction. Or if not, at the very least, it helps the company to set themselves up to be in a very good position to be a IP licensing company instead, as they can better understand how best to deal with the relationships with all of these game development firms, as well as how to spot who are the ones that would be actually better to work with instead. Nowadays, you could say that may not really be the thing anymore, since with the advent of all the AAA titles within the mobile gaming space, or games that reach that point, it's a lot harder for games produced by other companies to compete. But I would disagree, because the thing is that even within this space, it's not like most people only play one game. People who play the games tend to play multiple games, and many companies have also decided to therefore strategically try to target the more casual end of the space, where rather than trying to be the one game that you're super invested in playing all the time, they try to be something that, you know, you can just casually play for like 5 minutes a day. Maybe you don't have to log in all the time, but that actually keeps you interested enough to keep coming back so that you can continue to enjoy the story instead. And in that sense, there is still a space for many of these companies to target. And the thing is that with how broad the industry has become and how much the AAA side of the space has basically made many of the games look the same, there are people as well who have gotten sick of those games, funnily enough, and as a result, they might actually be willing to go on and play all of these other titles, which, while they may not be super intensive, they kind of strike a balance well enough that for someone who really wants to like have a mobile game experience with a huge focus on stories and characters you can enjoy, while not having to put a super huge time investment into it, because you do play games on other platforms as well, these games just end up suiting their taste better instead. It's part of the reason why, even with many of the mobile games today, one metric for measuring like how intensive a game is how quickly you can do the dailies, where there are games whose dailies have reached like 5 minutes or less. You can just quickly go through it and go and do something else instead and come back to the game whenever there's a big update, be it to the story or characters that you're really interested in, and you can play it more on your own pace instead. And it's because of the cost and profitability side concerns, as well as the ease of entry into this industry, as well as there still being a space for them to continue producing games at a slightly less risky but still fairly profitable pace, especially when you compare it to how some of them are doing when it comes to visual novels. That it does feel like many of the, especially the bigger visual novel companies out there, are still trying to make attempts into going into the space, and why it feels like at the very least for a little while longer they probably would continue to invest more into this space, or rather than just a visual novel on its own. For those who feel sad that their favorite eroge or visual novel company is no longer producing just visual novels and is shifting to something else, truth be told, I don't know what to say either. Like, life's tough. I get it. Like, many of these companies, they did this because the industry for visual novels on their own, they just aren't sustainable to the same level anymore, especially for the bigger companies out there, and so they needed to adapt, and that's why they are in the situation that they are, with some of them choosing to use all of the storytelling skills, the character building skills that they have to do basically what would be considered like and I feel like this would be offensive to visual novel enjoyers, so I won't like make this comparison, but it does feel like they are trying to create the equivalent of a visual novel in the mobile gaming space instead. Granted, it's a very different thing, and because of the state or the nature of the game, it's a lot harder for them to produce a complete work in the same way. But at this point, for some companies, the best compromise that they can make in order to keep producing visual novels on the side, or to keep the company just afloat for that matter. Like, it really is just tough for many of those big companies to continue to produce things at the scale that they used to in the past, and that really is just why they've begun to experiment in the way that they have. This is not to say that they are sure to collapse or that they are all gonna eventually shift out completely off the visual novel space. I feel like companies like Bason in particular actually do a pretty good job in striking a balance between trying to continue to produce interesting stories and visual novels, while also trying to ensure that the company can maintain its profitability by doing what they have done with some of their titles, like with Suzuki Karin, for example. You produce a visual novel RPG game first and foremost, and then use that as the base to then add on to it with a mobile game, where they have basically made a sequel for this game which continues on the storyline with a mobile game instead. And in that sense, they can continue to tell all of the big stories and interesting stories that they want to tell with a focus on the type of content that they want to make with the visual novels. But then they can also use the mobile games as something on the side to give people more of enjoyment of the individual games that they have produced, while also in a way ensuring that they are able to keep the company afloat. And on top of that, to also slowly develop the experience to be able to produce games of higher and higher quality, and to slowly shift into games themselves. Like with Suzuki Karin, it really was more of a game in a sense than just a visual novel, since they had shifted from a company that focused purely on the visual novel aspect to actually creating this little dungeon like defense game as well. In that sense, you can kind of see the growth of the company in ways that will allow them to eventually, perhaps even stretch it out and become even bigger scale in terms of the production of the type of games that they want to make. That said, for these visual novel companies that have leaned into the more mobile gaming, social game side of things, I'm not gonna sit here and like try and take the moral high ground and say look at them and how greedy they are, because I don't think they are. Like, granted, there may be some people in the companies that might be, and I know people who are, but there are still many people who have been in these companies since the earlier days, and there are many people who just want to provide a interesting game, an interesting story, and they see this as the most sustainable way to do it, and that's why they're in it. There are still many people who feel more like creators than they do businessmen trying to make a big buck. And this is something you can see from the way that many of these companies have handled the EOS of their titles. Companies like Ubisoft, companies like Tenko, when their mobile game died, they are, and even to this day they still are, especially with the case of Tenko, trying to reproduce the game in a way that can still be preserved in the future by turning it into a PC game that you can then enjoy on its own in isolation and still get the main crux of the game that they wanted to make, which was the story, which is something that you could say that many big AAA companies wouldn't even bother to do, just because they want to ensure that the work itself, the art, the music, music, the stories get preserved. Even with like visual arts, with like Itsubari no Arisu, that game is like barely scraping by now. I mean, it's like basically on life support in the most bizarre way, because they basically just declared to the people, the players, like, look, here, see, this is the issue at hand. We need to be able to pay for the servers to keep the game alive. If you help to pay for the servers, we'll keep it running for as long as possible, which is a horribly terrifying like idea from a business perspective. Like, even from a development perspective, I feel like it would have been better if they just EOS'd it and just like made an offline version of the game instead, rather than making people pay a monthly fee to keep the game alive with barely any content. Especially when you consider the fact that like it's not just the server, the company still has to pay for its employees and the people who are required to ensure that the game keeps running, and like even if no new content's added, the content keeps cycling through. Typically, that can all be done by like 2 to 3 people, maybe even 1 people if you have someone who's well versed enough in the build, in the way the game is constructed. But even then, there are things such as the human effort that has to be put into this that, you know, makes it not worth it from a business perspective. But for creators who want to ensure what they created, the thing they created that they have pride in, continues to exist, is something that you can see from the way all of this is handled. Right? These aren't the actions of a greedy corporation. If they really were a greedy corporation that wanted to squeeze as much money out of the players as possible, they would have EOS the game and ended the service of the game before it even got to this point. When profitability, it doesn't even have to make a loss. When profitability gets below a certain point, it would already make sense for them to cut the game. And the fact that they don't is proof that they are thinking about a lot more than just the profitability of the game, if anything. And the fact that, you know, they are willing to invest into redeveloping the game and making an offline version of it, which you don't even know if it will be able to sell well in the first place. Right? They're willing to take that gamble to go through the effort to do so. And in Tenko's case, they're going through the effort of rebalancing all of the characters in the game, remaking features so that you can play it as an offline RPG and have it work in its entirety instead of being something that requires you to have the new banner to complete, for example. Like, all of this is just proof that, like, even though they are going to the mobile game space, many of them are doing so with the intent of creating something interesting and seeing it as more of an avenue to continue creating something interesting, rather than looking at it as just a way for them to earn as much as possible. And it's perhaps because of all of this and my own potentially internal bias from having worked in the industry that I feel like while many of these big vision novel companies are shifting to making mobile gacha games instead, I don't feel overly doomerish about it, because in the end, many of the people who are driving these companies are the people who are at heart creators first, and this is to them an avenue for them to continue to produce the type of game that they want in the most sustainable way. With enough time, perhaps they will find a way to evolve the genre itself even further into something that will be sustainable even for bigger companies to continue producing this type of visual novel style games. Or maybe they might even shift into producing even bigger blockbuster titles. Who knows? Hopefully, through all of this, they might learn how to produce games with more efficiency, and then this would also then funnel back into the visual novel side of things as they learn how to produce all of this in a more cost-effective way, the way that many of these smaller, especially the more indie groups are doing it. And who knows, this might actually allow them to even produce these games at an even greater pace than before, due to the fact that they now have more people working under them who have the experience needed to produce these. Or they might even shift into making something like a bigger scale RPG or something else for that matter, which might actually end up being interesting in its own way and might actually cause an interesting shift for the genre as well. That's it. That's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you all for watching. I hope this video was interesting. If you find this video interesting, do like and subscribe. We talk about just the general gaming industry in Japan, maybe once every 2 months, thereabout. Sometimes smaller videos talking about very specific things as well. But you know, for me, I just find this kind of videos interesting to make. So if you like it, do feel free to like and subscribe. And if you want to see more content, not from me, but from the actual visual novel companies that you like, support visual novel sales. I get that it can be kind of expensive, and for some people it's a little difficult to want to purchase the game when they don't produce it in English, so you can't even play it in the language you like. But if you like it and you get the opportunity to, do support them, because like it's through the sales that they can even continue to survive in the first place. Even if you're gonna get the game through slightly more illicit means, right? I wouldn't know what you're gonna do, but if you do and you somehow get a copy of the game and you did enjoy it, do go back and purchase the game when you you actually have the capability to do so. While you may not be able to play it in the language itself, it's still a good way to show support to the company and to show them that there is a market for their games, even outside of Japan, which is something that's going to be very important, all the more so for them to want to continue to produce more. That's it. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to the very epic people here for helping to support the channel as always. It's thanks to you guys I can continue to produce videos like this, and especially for this video, there was quite a lot of data I had to gather as well on the sales of the game as well, and because of this, yeah, it can cost a little bit of money to actually even get all of this off the ground as well. Thankfully, it doesn't reach the point where I need to grease some pumps with some of the people I know in the industry to get information as well. But yeah, you never know in the future. Some information might be a little harder to get as well, so I shouldn't say that. But that said, thank you all for helping to support the channel and helping to make it easier for me to continue to focus on making this kind of videos and not have to like all earn on working 40 hours a month to be able to get that overtime pay to sustain myself. So even to you guys who just watch the videos as well, it gives me a lot of motivation to keep making more. So thank you to everyone, and I'll see you guys in the next one.